Hello everyone, welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of Garchkabe. My name is Dalian.
And I'm Salpi Özgür.
This is our first episode in English and we hope many more will come in the future.
Today we have Arnold Alahverdian as our guest. He is the co-founder and co-director of Bright Garden Voices. A bit of background. Arnold was born in Iran. He currently lives in the United States, California, and he is doing a PhD in history. What was your motivation when you established Bright Garden Voices?
Hello, Salpi and Shant, and thank you very much for having me on this great podcast. Founded Bade Vogjuin Salam to all our listeners. So, as we know, there was this brutal war, this recent Nagorno Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Caucasus. And this war was in many ways also carried on social media and other platforms of interactions. We saw a lot of, toxic rhetoric, language, a lot of hostility. Almost any constructive or good intention, voice was lost in the sea of trolls and hostility and interruptions. So about a couple of months after the war, there were certain individuals on social media, a small group. We were talking to each other, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, even, non-Armenian, non-Azerbaijanis, about the conflict, about, dialogue, trying to understand each other, and, reflecting on this, really brutal war that happened. It was a bit difficult because, there was so many people with strong emotions, with, these hateful emotions and all these trolls that are always present there. We decided to create this platform for this space where constructive voices could be heard, where there could be more understanding, empathy, and especially rehumanization. There is so much dehumanization in this conflict between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, so we want to do our best to humanize each side to the other. Diego Arduan, he's Argentinian actually, now my friend, who's has been active on Caucasus Twitter, and Aidan and myself, Aidan Gasimova, who used to be active with Bright Garden, not anymore, one of the co-founders. We decided to create this platform where we could have these conversations, especially bringing real people, real faces, real voices together, to create this alternative platform where interactions could take place, for constructive, good interactions could take place. We decided perhaps Zoom is a good platform, especially since so many people during the pandemic became more tech friendly. They learned how to use Zoom. They learned they have more time to be online. We slowly started covering topics, how to have dialogue about film, visuals, etc, bringing people together to discuss with each other, more than just the topics, just the fact that we are joining each other, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and talking to each other, not in a hostile manner, but in civil dialogue. That in itself is the achievement, to create these examples of people that we can engage in civil dialogue. And we upload this on YouTube, these meetings. Of course, audiences can join us live and ask questions. We have also started Instagram Live, call them garden chats. We invite an individual to interview, and we have question and answers. We also have started doing real life interviews, real life meetings, and we will record them and put them on YouTube. So the main goal is for understanding, empathy, and rehumanization. We might not have the power to change politics. I think we have the responsibility to do our best to rehumanize the sides. This goes a long way. Even during wars, it is better to, fight a humanized enemy rather than a dehumanized one.
Dialogue is also very important for us. We are trying to encourage dialogue with Garchkabe all the time. There are many people in Turkey who see Armenians as enemies, but as we were born in Turkey, we have had many Turkish friends, so it really is saddening to see that many on both sides were, as you said, dehumanizing the others. So we find what you are trying to do very good. How should we engage with each other, Azerbaijanis, Turks, and Armenians alike?
That is a very good question. And yeah, and Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and Turks are in this, peculiar situation. For most people, I would say jumping into topics of disagreement and, this where there's like hostile, like different narratives from the start will probably not bear fruit, it depending on who the individuals are. Many people have, internalized certain narratives and, these feelings of hatred and enmity towards the other group from a young age. It would take a lot for them to reprogram their minds and emotions. I think for most cases, for many people, it is very important to first get to know real people from the other side. And, if it's not possible in real life, the internet more than easily makes that possible now with all these social media spaces, if you find actually the right platform and the right people or people to guide you to these people. Like knowing real people, this really prevents you from thinking about the other side in a way that is, unrealistically dehumanizing or as the, unrealistic enemy, etc. It allows your brain to process people you might consider as your foes in a different light. The people who have actually close friends or just friends from what they might consider their ethnic groups or nation states enemies, they tend to be more welcoming to dialogue because they are already sort of friends with people of that group. Most importantly, respect, empathy, sincerity, open-mindedness, these are all universal values. People who have these values, who are willing to be open-minded, they will find a way to hold civil dialogue. Some people might be a lost cause, depending on how they identify themselves in respect to the other side as enemies, etc. And once you establish a respectful relationship with someone, then dialogue just becomes possible. It is important to be a very good listener, not to quickly resort to whataboutism. For example, someone brings something up and you're like, oh, well, your group did that too. So then the conversation can lead to nowhere. Or denialism, even, if it's your instinct to think the other side is wrong about a certain, current or historical event, then it might just be worth listening to them before just contradicting them and attacking them for their views. Yeah, and what I think people who have platforms, people who are already engaged in dialogue, I think the best way to go about this is to create these spaces where there can be real well-intentioned interactions, with the other side respectfully, to show examples of people interacting in a civil way, for good people holding dialogue for understanding mutually beneficial reasons. Actually heard from actual people about this. Sometimes it just takes one example or one conversation to change someone's mind. And people who have listened to Bright Garden or who have interacted with people after the war, they have literally told me that, me hearing him or her say this thing, it changed my view of looking at the conflict or after a short conversation. So it is important for, people like us who have a platform to facilitate this.
Everything you said was great. And during the war, what I realized was there were very extreme people on both sides, and they were like too much for me. And I've seen some sane people on all sides, the Turks, the Armenians, the Azerbaijanis. And there were a lot of people who were just trying to be rational and who wanted the best for everyone. Whilst there were other people who wanted to like fuel this rage and hatred towards each other. But when you like look at it geographically, we're all so close, like Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and these countries should really get along. For example, crisis breaks out like COVID, and all of the people in these countries suffered almost the same way. All of the people in these countries suffer from similar political leaders. And as you said, we're not political figures. We're not political leaders, and maybe we don't have so much power in our hands to make drastic changes. But everyday interactions, relationships, understanding each other, and the most important one is dialogue, of course. Just creating the space and holding the space for other people can maybe transform all the hatred and generational trauma and create maybe something beautiful. And what you're trying to do in Bright Garden Voices is exactly this, as far as I can see, which is something I highly appreciate, because I do understand people with nationalistic tendencies, and I can understand that has become an identity for them. But our identity is so much more nuanced, because we're not just Armenians, we're also people, and we have like other roles. Like, for example, you can be a teacher, you can be a physician, you can be a father, you can be a daughter, you can be a lot of things. So it is important to understand we're not just made of one identity, and we don't have to hold on to it in a way that becomes toxic and even hurts ourselves, our community, and other people. And with this much negativity, it is not possible to benefit our own community or the world. So what I wanted to ask you is, you're doing something great, and like Bright Garden Voice with your partner, we're trying to do something here with the podcast and the whole culture and dialogue and all that. What could people who are listening to this podcast right now, everyday people, Turks, Azerbaijanis, Armenians from Diaspora, Armenians living in Armenia, all of the people listening to this, like in everyday life, what could they do? What actions they could take? I'm a very action oriented person. When I believe in an idea, a movement, a sentiment, I directly act on it. I do something to just support that. So I wanted to have your opinion on this. Like, what could they do?
Very good question. Very relevant for us. Yes, ultranationalist and, emotionally charged voices have this tendency to hold hegemony sometimes, various platforms, including social media, whenever there is a conflict. And sometimes it is very hard, right? If you want to have sober take, critical take on something, you could be attacked. I mean, especially the recent war is still very fresh, especially for the Armenians, us who have we feel like we have lost something, the unfavorable outcome and everything that happened. I think one very useful step we should take, well, first of all, we have to really be, what are our principles, what are our universal principles. We think about humanity, and thinking individually. You as an individual, what do you think is right, is wrong? What are the limits? What are some principles you hold? Are you critical? What are your biases? We have to educate ourselves on our own biases. I think I am very biased, and that could be based on my experiences, could be based on because I interact with certain people more. For example, I interact with Armenians more versus Azeris and Turks. So I could have a bias because of that, or many other things, my political views and etc. One good way to counter, these hateful voices that could become hegemonic is to form real life or online communities with people who share your values. And this is just as important to do this with the people within your ethnic group or nation state that you associate with, because there is a lot of different opinions among Armenians, there among Turks, among Azerbaijanis, and we should be very aware of this. There are a lot of people who think the same way you do, and many people who are not, just closed-eyed, like just hostile. And it is very important that you feel like you have this community, or else constructive voices could feel isolated during times of conflict. It's good to make this community, to support each other through talking to each other, to when someone gets attacked, you have each other's back, and to show other people examples that you exist. You as a community of, sober, well-intentioned, constructive thinkers exist, both within your own ethnic national group, and, you can make groups that include Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Turks, etc. Actually, I've seen various examples of this on social media. There's like huge, for example, Facebook groups. There are, like these group chats, even people interacting with Bright Garden Voices. But there's so many different platforms that have been established, so people don't feel isolated when they hold these sort of views about dialogue, about understanding the other side. It is perhaps generally good to ignore hostile voices. Me personally, I sometimes want to interact with alternationalist or hostile or hateful voices, because a lot of these people tend to be emotional, super emotional, emotionally charged. In a lot of cases, even a simple short conversation can change their minds. Of course, some people can't handle this, talking to voices that are very emotionally charged or very hateful, but it could be worth a try if you have the sort of mental capacity to handle it. And yeah, and Bright Garden Voices has been criticized in the past, especially when we first started. I have been, attacked on social media and elsewhere, not physically, but been harassed and been sent threats. But these were just, very angry reactions of what happened during the war. So try to form communities, try to find people who have the same values, both within your group, the groups you associate with, and with others, Armenians, Turks, Azerbaijanis. Try to be truthful to yourself, be self-critical, know your bias. That will go a long way.
We should form communities, but I find it really hard to find, let's not say sane, but sober people as some of us, because the hostile are most of the time the majority. Whenever there's a conflict, all I hear are these hostile voices. How can we hear the other voices through these?
Before Arnold answers that question, I'd like to make an addition as a hardcore individualist, but uh, all these perspectives, all these like hatred and all the extremes fuel emotions and movements more because they give you an ecstatic, dynamic identity, which is how some people fill the void in themselves when in fact what they should do is to build themselves, but that takes more of an effort. So anything with this much passion, this much energy is directly more attractive to people. So I think that's the first obstacle we have to come. There is something so passionate that calls you, but you say like, no, I'm going to inspect this, even though it is tempting to hate, even though it is very tempting to be extreme, to abuse, to be like power hungry, and just maybe, I don't know, hate on people as a group. uh, so this, for starters, with anything, not just this, in order to be rational and in order to maybe find the middle ground or like the thing that is the closest to the truth, but the first thing we have to do is to, I don't know, resist the temptation to go to the extremes, even though it is very, very tempting. And I'm sorry to interrupt now. I think Arnold can continue.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Especially, when we're talking about Turks, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, I think each of us have this, narrative of being the victim. And, sometimes it's hard to imagine yourself not being the victim. Of course, historically, the situation has been very different. It's not the same event or the same, comparable all the time, but each side has internalized the narratives of being right and being the victim. And and when you see something brutal from a war or something, it's so easy for it to trigger those feelings, and especially since they have been so politically convenient, used by in politics in your society. And yeah, and you choose to learn the things, the parts of, for example, history or the events that make yourself look good, or the victim or the righteous one. Yeah, it just takes, for some people, you have to just, it takes time after maybe conflict to calm down enough to have a sober look at things. And it's tough, and it is tough, and that is why the numbers are rather relatively perhaps small of people who want to hold dialogue. Even like educated people with with high degrees, PhDs, even they could just be as hateful and as as not sober, if that's a word, for example, as anyone else. And to answer, for example, for Shant saying that it is hard to find people who have the same values, if you're more leaning towards the liberal side when it comes to dialogue, etc. I think for me personally, it was making some constructive statements, but especially when you say something that could be interpreted as controversial, then the hateful people on social media or the trolls circulate it, and then more people who think like you actually find you. So for Bright Garden, when we first started, for example, it was mostly the trolls and these hateful accounts that are spreading these things about us, and people who are like-minded to us, they actually found us from that. And it just takes finding one good people in what a few good individuals involved in dialogue or who have been involved to meet more and more and more. So I wasn't actually involved on social media much, especially Twitter, before the war. It was just putting out some statements out there that I ended up finding more and more people who thought like me. And I felt less isolated. They felt less isolated. So, it begins a movement, even though it's not mainstream.
I really hope that like minded people can find us and each other. Last but not least, we would like to talk about something we discussed before the podcast, the diaspora. I have never considered myself a part of the Armenian diaspora, and I don't think anyone in the diaspora considers us Bolso-Hais as such. So, what do you think will happen with the diaspora? There's not one entity, of course, but what should the diaspora do in the future?
Yeah, that is very, very interesting question. And it really, you can spend an eternity, I think, answering that. So just considering what is the diaspora, there's, I think, multiple definitions of this. One of them, anyone outside of the Republic of Armenia. I think the more relatively correct one would be, I don't know if you would consider Armenians in Turkey or Armenians in Iran. Some people, scholarly, they could probably not be considered the diaspora because they've lived there for hundreds of years, or that is in many ways the center of Armenian civilization, the birth of Armenian civilization. Eastern Turkey, Armenian highlands, Anatolia, north parts of northwestern Iran, even, or even central Iran, Tehran, etc. What is the diaspora? Of course, Armenians in the West. Well, Armenians have had diasporic communities in large numbers perhaps since the early modern times, since about the 19th century, more so in the West and of course in Russia. There are just so many different groups, so many different views. We are assimilating more. Each individual has a different way of interacting with their Armenian community or the Republic of Armenia or place where they're from. So we are becoming more assimilated in many ways in the societies we live in. In places like Los Angeles, where I am, there is a much larger group, a percentage of Armenians in the county. So there is more, real life interaction. There's more Armenian schools. People tend to marry more Armenians. In other places, there is more mixing. Throughout the generations, we will see people become, for example, more half Armenians, quarter Armenians. Maybe this would maybe cause some of them to think of them less as Armenians or more, more diverse in the way they identify themselves ethnically, nationally. So we have a lot of resources in the diaspora in creating cultural things, literature, thinking about the future, both in the republic and in the community we live in. How do we become a good community in the place we are at, both beneficial to our own community or perhaps even to the Republic of Armenia, where we somehow, I think most of us feel some sort of a connection. It is just, I don't know, it is just so many different experiences, from Russia to France to places like Germany and the US, Australia. Yeah, we have these groups, we have organizations, we have groups. It is just important, I think, to keep ourselves culturally alive. And no matter, we have to be inclusive of everyone who considers themselves Armenians, who wants to be involved with the Armenian community. We can't just build barriers. We have to be inclusive, I think.
What I think is diaspora has become like a digital thing rather than something connected to a location. So, what I feel like is when you're creating content for the international Armenian community, such as what you're doing right now, and many other great organizations are doing, you're part of the diaspora. So, it sounds like it means that at the moment for me, not living in the United States and being Armenian, but being part of international community that can be networked through digital platforms And I think it has also become something of that sort when we're interacting with each other on Twitter as Armenians in English. I don't know, that feels like that is the diaspora rather than Armenians living in non Armenia countries. But I think that's just my interpretation of it. And our identities have shifted due to the globalization and the digitalization of the world, and that applies to every other identity in the world. So I think sometimes we have to redefine certain things, and at the moment this is the best we've got, so maybe we have to just use this and move on with this one.
Salpi, may I interrupt you? That is an excellent point, actually. I forgot to even mention that. I think all three of us, I think we're more involved with the diaspora online, maybe, or voices in the diaspora who are, actively writing things, etc., to do with Armenians, etc. So, in many ways, we have this great advantage now. We are a global community. We can do a lot of good things online. We should try to use it well.
Definitely, definitely. I think this is a very valuable thing. And I really appreciate having the opportunity to come together like this and produce something for our community. It is, I think, one of the best things this whole new communication methods have given us. So that is something to really appreciate and utilize, even. And this is something all Armenians, Turks, Azerbaijanis, everyone who wants to be involved in the dialogue should consider and definitely use. And what I believe, dialogue is the only way to create prosperous future for all of these communities, because it is so apparent that war is not benefiting anyone, and hatred is not a good identity to wear and live with. So, the best we can do is to preach dialogue, friendship, relationships, and we share so much culturally. Like today, I can understand most of us like live in different countries, and most of our community is affected by the global narrative, and we live by like the modern global rules and modes of living. But still, when you go back like a century, you can see our ancestors lived so similarly, actually, the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians. Of course, there were some nuances, especially religion wise, but geographically, it is so close. A lot of things were similar, and maybe we have to remind ourselves that we've shared so much. We have a lot of things common, and maybe that is the way we come together through music, through arts, through storytelling. This could be my wishful thinking, but I'm trying to look on the more constructive side, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, that is a resource we have. This culturally we are very, very similar, especially Eastern Armenians with Azerbaijanis and Western Armenians with Turks, right? Yeah. And these are resources we could utilize in a beneficial way. Just to let you know that I was actually also somewhat involved in a Turkey Armenia program, and I hope that more programs like Bright Garden Voices or your platform and other platforms would emerge more and more, to facilitate dialogue between Turks and Armenians.
We really should have more of these activities and platforms. I hope this hostility between our communities ends soon. So, thank you for coming. This was really valuable, and hopefully, our listeners have gotten something out of this.
Thank you so much, Shant, and thank you so much, Salpi, and thank you for actually, having this podcast, like to for creating this platform. And I know you will, achieve great things with it. I hope your audience grows, and I know that you will cover very interesting content.
Thank you very much. Could you just tell our listeners where can they find your podcast and other Bright Garden Voices content?
Sure. So we are all over social media, actually, on YouTube, Bright Garden Voices. Just search that and you will see us. On Twitter is Bright Garden We, or just write Bright Garden Voices. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram, where we do our Instagram lives, where you can actually access those on Instagram. So Bright Garden Voices all around social media. We have podcasts. We also include our meetings as podcasts on various podcast services, Spotify, Google, etc., etc. We have a link tree. If you search Bright Garden Voices link tree, you will find all of our content on one page.
Thank you, Arnold, for coming, and we appreciate having had this conversation with you. Then we can now end this podcast and see you next time.
It was a pleasure, Salpi and Shant. Thank you for having me. Cheers.
You can listen to us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. You can follow our podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Make sure to subscribe.